Hi, I'm Bernard Isaacson from the New Jersey Forest Service, which is in the Division of Parks and Forestry within New Jersey's Department of Environmental Protection. I'm also an ecology graduate student at Rutgers University. This project is a team effort between New Jersey Forest Service, Rutgers University, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Research Service out of Beltsville, Maryland. So my collaborators on this project are Dr. Yun Yang from the USDA and University of Maryland, Dr. Martha Anderson from the USDA, and Dr. Jason Gabrowski from Rutgers. This project is an investigation into the behavior of landscape scale evapotranspiration in the forests of South Jersey. We'll be looking at density, disturbance, and management and their effects on the behavior of ET. I'm also going to turn off the camera for the rest of this presentation just so that you can hear a disembodied voice from behind the camera to save bandwidth. So a little outline of this talk. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Pinelands forest and what state it's in right now. We'll talk a little bit about the Kirkwood Cohansey Aquifer, which underlies this region, and then how we modeled evapotranspiration at the landscape scale using the dysalexy model. Then the results of that model and the effects of functional type, density, and management on forest water use, and then why this is important. We'll bring it back around with some references to scale. So what we're looking at here is a photo, just happened to be in Wharton State Forest about 2 months ago, photo looking up at the crowns in this part of the forest. And you can see that there's very little live crown ratio in a lot of these trees. The diameter of the crowns can be measured in a handful of feet for a lot of these trees. And so this is sort of indicative of the density-induced stress that we're seeing in a lot of the pinelands right now. That these are forests that the trees are starting to kill each other, which is probably outside the normal historical range of variation. Contrast that with what that historical range of variation might have looked like. This is a photo from the 1907 report of the agency that later became the New Jersey Forest Service. And you can see that this is a very different landscape. These trees have a much larger live crown ratio, much broader crowns. Yeah, there are dead trees, but there's plenty of sunlight hitting the forest floor and giving you a very different plant community. That's in stark contrast to what we have today. Note that it says frequent surface fires prevent reproduction. Right, there was intermediate types of disturbance that managed competition in this, or governed competition in this landscape. And that's different than what we have today. So we can see some of that condition of the forest today versus what it was historically from this this pair of air photos. So this is a photo mosaic on the left here from 1940 and on the right from 2015. So for example, you can see this area here. There was a cut that led to the lack of crowns. The dark little speckles here are crowns, and you see lots of bare sand. That would be the white dots in there. Also, you can see that areas like this less dense patch of forest today in 2015 on the right pretty much appear homogeneous with the rest of the landscape. And so there's been quite a bit of change to this landscape in terms of lack of disturbance and increased forest density that leaves it being more homogeneous and in a very different condition than it was in 1940. We have other ways than air photos of being systematic about evaluating forest occupancy. So this is forest inventory data that were collected by New Jersey Forest Service. These are variable radius prism swings, BAF10. So Brendan Burns State Forest is the brown curve you see on the left. Wharton State Forest is the green you see on the right. And these are both distributions, so you're looking at a sort of continuous histogram. These are kernel density plots. So I shaded the area underneath the curve, right, because the area is the thing that we're interested in. You'll see more of these densities in other plots, but this is the only one where they're shaded just because it gets really messy in the future plots. But the point of this is to show that relative density has increased. So relative density is the x-axis here. That's the current stand density index divided by the maximum possible stand density index for that plot. The numbers for that come from, the calculations for that come from the U.S. Forest Service's Forest Vegetation Simulator. So the takeaway here is that the forest has gotten quite a bit denser. The Pinelands forest has gotten quite a bit denser. Yes, these are two different state forests, but they're in the same landscape, managed by the same people, governed by the same regulations, managed out of the same office. So whatever's going on in one is probably going on in the other. So we're seeing an increase in density. So that got me thinking when reading publications about the water budget in these areas. So the water budget in most of the pinelands, at least in the forested areas, is basically split between evapotranspiration and recharge. So any water that the trees don't drink, the vegetation doesn't use, goes down into the aquifer, goes into recharge. Those are both an order of magnitude more important than any other component of the water budget. It follows then that whatever's going on with evapotranspiration is going to determine in large part what happens to the aquifer. So the aquifer we're talking about is the Kirkwood Cohansey aquifer, which covers a large swath of southern New Jersey, most of our outer coastal plain. You can see it here in the black line around it as the boundary, and then the blue is the aquifer. The green that you see there is forest land cover, and the yellow boundary is the Pinelands National Reserve, so this is a jurisdictional boundary. Certainly within the Pinelands, but also within the aquifer as a whole, forest is the dominant land cover. So it follows then that if evapotranspiration is driving the water budget in forested areas, and forest covers the large majority of the aquifer, then whatever's going on in evapotranspiration in the forest is going to play an outsized role in recharge for the aquifer. So what's going on with the aquifer? Well, the black triangles that you see here are USGS wells. There's a number of USGS wells scattered throughout South Jersey. These ones just happen to be on the state forests. And the white hatching that you see there, the upper hatching is Brendan Burn State Forest, and the lower left there is Wharton State Forest. And the monitoring well data, I took those data, that's the black lines on those subplots. I detrended it to take out the seasonality, so that's the blue line, and then fit a linear model to the trend line, the blue trend. And that shows that there's been a decrease for all of these. There's been a decrease. It's been about 1 to 2 feet over the last 60 years. So this is a slow but steady decline in water levels. And that often gets attributed to development, but no one has really talked about whether there's the possibility that that's attributed to something else. So to look at landscape scale evapotranspiration, we turn to remote sensing. So we use the Disalexi model, which is the disaggregated air-land exchange interface model. This was developed from the two-source energy balance model and has been used in agricultural systems and more recently with forest systems in North Carolina. The inputs for this model first are at the 4 kilometer scale, so that's geostationary. The geostationary orbiting environmental satellite GOES. That's whenever you look at weather maps where they're showing the progression of a hurricane, right? Those maps that update every few minutes, that's GOES data. So using GOES data, we model evapotranspiration at the 4 kilometer scale, then use MODIS data, so the moderate resolution imaging spectrometer, to model water use at the finer scale. Both of those are daily. Then using Landsat data to model it at the 30 meter scale, and then interpolating between the Landsat dates to get daily scale evapotranspiration. So what you're left with is a daily estimate of evapotranspiration at the 30 meter scale. So where we applied the model is here over our study area, over the central and southern part of New Jersey. The blue diamonds are our Wharton and Penn State Forest inventory plots. You can see the little icon there for US SLT is the US Forest Service's Silas Little Research Station Flux Tower. Ken Clark set that one up, and we used that Flux Tower data from Ameriflux to evaluate the performance of the Disalexi model. You can see that there's lots of other types of events going on in this landscape. So there's the orange is prescribed fire, the hatching is for wildfires. So this is a pretty rich area for examining disturbance and what's going on with the forest. And what does that map look like? What does that model output look like? So we're looking here at May 16th, 2016. The warmer colors indicate more water use, higher evapotranspiration. The cooler colors indicate less evapotranspiration. So this actually matches up pretty well with what we would expect. So we've got here an extensive wetland complex. In May, it's leafed out, it's pumping lots of water, it's ample water available. We've got these, if you can see at the end of that arrow, there's a little bit of blue. The fields at Batstow is a historic village that used to have an iron forge. Most of it's covered with warm season grasses, so they haven't really started pumping water yet in May. Directly adjacent to Batstow, there's a stand of dense Atlantic white cedar, which has full foliage already at this time of year, so it's going to be pumping a lot of water. And then Winslow Wildlife Management Area to the west, where there's more swamp hardwoods, so not quite as leafy as a cedar forest. And then the Atlantic Blueberry Company, so blueberry fields that don't have very much vegetation, and so they're very cool, right? They appear very cool in color here because they're not pumping much water. So here's an evaluation of the performance of the model over the flux tower site. The red lines are the remote sensing modeled evapotranspiration value. It says star FM, that's because that's the algorithm used to fill in between the diamonds, the red diamonds, that's the Landsat dates. And the blue circles are the flux tower based measurements of ET. And so we modeled ET over 4 years, 2015 through 2018. And on a day-to-day basis, there is quite a bit of variance between the observation on the ground and the remote sensing model output. But at the annual time scale, that's actually a really, really small difference. It ends up being around 1%. So we think this does a pretty good job of measuring how much water is being used by the forest. So of our forest inventory data, basically it was dominated by pines. If we break this into 5 different categories, upland and lowland pine, out of the 6,000 inventory plots over Wharton, more than half of them are dominated by southern yellow pines. So mainly that's our pitch pine and shortleaf pine. We also do have some plots that are Atlantic white cedar, swamp hardwood, or oak. So the swamp hardwoods would be red maple and black gum. The oak is black oak, white oak, chestnut oak, post oak. But we're going to focus on the pines because they cover most of the study area and they're the most extensive. So again, following the thing that's got the most behind it. So in terms of composition, we can see pretty clear differences based off of what species are present. So from year to year, the pattern's relatively consistent. The oaks are that kind of brown-orange on the left. The Atlantic white cedar is blue on the right, and pines, and whether they're upland or lowland, and swamp hardwoods are kind of in the middle every year. So the oaks are using less water, cedar is using the most water, and then the pine is using an intermediate amount between the two. Mainly this difference is being driven in the springtime between March and May. You can see that on this month-by-month plot, using the same colors, using 2018 data, that it's in March, April, and May when the oaks haven't leafed out that they're kind of lagging behind on water use. They catch up later in the season, but because we have frost out into May in this region, the oaks don't leaf out until May. And so the other species kind of get ahead of them, particularly the coniferous species, right? Because they've got dark green foliage, they're absorbing solar energy, warming themselves up so that in those shoulder seasons they can photosynthesize just as soon as they get enough sunny days. So if we assess sort of functional groups without using the inventory data, just using the land use data from DEP, so the brown broken line is oak uplands in Wharton and Brendan Burn State Forest, so or just deciduous uplands, which happen to be oak in those areas. The blue line is Atlantic white cedar wetlands, and the green and pink are coniferous forest and deciduous wooded wetlands. And so it's following the same behavior, right? Where we have oaks using the least amount of water, with Atlantic white cedar wetlands using the most, and pines and swamp maple using kind of in between. So if we take the same approach and we look at uplands, just uplands, we start to notice some really interesting patterns. So here, the darker brown has more oak. This is just Wharton and Brendan Burn. The darker green has more pine. The solid lines are forests that have greater than 50% canopy closure, and the broken lines are 10 to 50% canopy closure. And so consistently from year to year, the higher proportion of conifers uses more water, and the closed forest uses more water. So if you've got a closed canopy and you've got more conifers, you're using more water. That's pretty similar to data that have come out of COWIDA and U.S. Forest Service research stations. So I wanted to chase that density aspect down a little bit. So here we're looking at, on a year-by-year basis, the evapotranspiration against the stand density index value for a plot from the inventory data. And this is just looking at plots that have a lower QMD, so less than 8 inches. So we have better distribution of the data. and where the core plots are less than 80 years old. So that should subset out anything that's multi-aged and should just have even age plots. And so there's a weak relationship, but it's consistent. There's a weak relationship in each year and it's consistent. And the slope is the same, which is worth paying attention to. A linear model doesn't give us the best fit, so I did the same thing, but plotted everything together and applied a logarithmic model. So what we're looking at here is instead of looking at the absolute amount of water, which is what we were looking at on the previous slide, I normalized it, so we just gave it as z-scores of the data. And when you do that, you see that actually the relationship is pretty consistent year to year. The r-squared improves to about 0.14, 0.15, depending on the year. But at lower SDIs, there's a significant, small, but significant difference in the amount of water use. So here's the same plot, just looking at, again, the young and even age stands. The previous one was of the of all pine stands. The slope is very similar, and it's consistent from year to year. So what about the effects of management on ET? So the y-axis here is the normalized annual ET, so that's a z-score off of the deviation of a pixel that's been thinned from what its land use norm would be. So that way we can compare different thinnings that occurred in different forest types. And what we see is this pattern. It's worth pointing out that a bunch of these are from the same events, so they're not totally independent, but we're substituting space for time here. So for instance, all of those pixels all those points represent pixels that occurred from the same thinning, just in different years. So here's 2015, here's what it looked like in 2016, here in 2017, and here in 2018. And that's something to keep in mind when you look at this plot in the next few. So if we pool the data, we have enough information from the 4 different years to fit a function to describe the effect of thinning on water yield. So this is a logistic growth model, and what you can see is that the effect lasts about 5 to 10 years. Once you get to that 5 to 10 year mark, the forest kind of returns to normal in terms of evapotranspiration. And that's really exciting, because that means for the first 5 to 10 years after you conduct thinning, you are increasing the amount of water that recharges into the aquifer. It's basically the amount of time it takes for the forest to reoccupy the growing space that was opened up by the thinning itself. So compare the effects of the thinning to the effects of a seed tree harvest. So we have enough data here, because there are a lot more seed tree harvests that happen in the Pinelands than there are thinnings. You have enough data here to fit 4 different functions, one for each year, to kind of see how robust the relationship is. And the effect lasts about 10 to 15 years. It's a deeper effect, right? So that there's more of a deviation in ET, so more recharge that you get from a seed tree harvest, and it lasts a few more years. And that makes sense, right? We would expect that with a thinning, there's residual trees, a lot more residual trees, to fill in the growing space. They just have to grow more. But with a regeneration harvest, new trees have to get established. So if we pool the data together to fit a single function, we see the same thing. For the first 10 to 15 years after a regeneration cut, there's a decrease in evapotranspiration and an increase in recharge. And compare that again to the effect of prescribed burning. So you can see that in the first year after that event, you still have plenty of pixels that are using just as much water as they were before. So there's a lot of variability from prescribed burning. It really depends on the prescription that's applied, the day it's applied. So there are some pixels for whom we'll see an anomaly that lasts a year or more, but it really depends on all those other factors. So I'm going to continue the analysis here and look at daily scale, weekly and monthly scale to see how long the effect lasts rather than the annual scale. So let's put those numbers in context. Knowing what we know about the weak but significant relationship between forest density and forest water use, as well as how forest occupancy has changed over time, if we apply those relationships to just the upland pine forest above the Kirkwood Cohansey Aquifer in South Jersey, today's forest is using about 14.5 billion gallons per year more water than the forest of 1980. To put that in context, that's about the same order of magnitude as the statewide annual consumptive water loss from agriculture in New Jersey. So this is water that's pumped out of the system for irrigation that doesn't filter back in. So that's pretty significant, right? It tells us that changes in forest policy, changes in forest land use, and our behavior towards that forest are going to have as big of an effect on our water resources as other land use decisions, other industries. So it's worth paying attention to know what's going on with the forest. Before I wrap up, I just want to make sure to say thank you to the large number of people that have helped along the way with this project, whether it be looking over figures, suggesting ideas, inspiring analysis, or whether it be getting cut up by Greenbrier during inventory time and collecting really good data. I just wanted to say thank you. So the next steps for this research are to continue to look at the different effects of management and different disturbances, to interface with other agencies, to share data, to do better water budgeting, and also I think it'd be really worthwhile to look at historical management regimes. So 200 years ago, this was an industrial landscape being clear-cut on the 20-year rotation for fuel wood, and what did that do to water yield? Also, I think it'd be worthwhile to forecast the effects of future management scenarios on the water budget. With that, I'll say thank you for coming to this talk. Feel free to reach out to me in the session here or to contact me at my email address below, bernard.isaacson@dep.nj.gov. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you have a good rest of your conference and a happy Halloween. Thank you very much.